Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
In that bitter winter, when the breath froze in the moustaches of cabmen and a pearly rime lay on the stained panes of even the meanest houses, London wore a muffled aspect which lent to the familiar streets an air of conspiracy. The muffled thud of wheels over snow and the sudden rush of wind that made the gas lamps bow and flare seemed to whisper of hidden things. It was during that memorable frost, when the newspapers filled their columns with accounts of skaters upon the Serpentine and of unfortunates found insensible in doorways, that we were drawn into the singular affair which I have named, for want of a fitter title, after its most striking circumstance. On the morning in question I had found Holmes in a humour of such abstraction as I had come to regard with a mixture of amusement and admiration. He sat at his usual place upon the left of our fire, his slippered feet extended to the blaze, and his long, nervous fingers toying idly with his pipe, which remained unlit. The Persian slipper which hung upon the mantelpiece bulged with tobacco, chemical odours of no kindly sort drifted from the table, and the violin lay under the sofa with a fold of newspaper across its strings as though even music had been silenced by the weather. He had been, since dawn, at the open window in his dressing gown, observing the traces which the storm had confided to the pavement of Baker Street. Our breakfast had been cleared away, and Mrs. Hudson's solicitude over his neglect of it received with a smile and a wave of the hand, when there came the quick knock, half brisk and half peremptory, which I had learned to associate with the official world. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade, his whiskers beaded with melted snow and his frayed comforter askew, was ushered in. "Mr. Holmes," said he, shedding a white shower as he unbuttoned his overcoat, "I've been driven to the conclusion that you must be thawed out for us. We've a case that's as cold and as hot as anything I've known." Holmes, who had not stirred at his entrance, raised his eyes for the fraction of a second to the inspector's boots, in which the snow clung only to the right instep. "You have walked against the wind upon the north pavement," he observed listlessly. "Pray warm yourself. You have not breakfasted." Lestrade blinked at him as men do when they will not surrender wonder to a foe, and came to the fire. "I breakfasted at 7. I've been at Cavendish Square since a little after 8, and I've not been warm since. There's a gentleman dead there that gives us all the trouble we can manage, and if you can make head or tail of it, Mr. Holmes, I shall be the first to say there's none like you in London." "A gentleman dead at Cavendish Square," said Holmes in the same quiet tone. "From the manner in which you press your lips, not death by misadventure. Something in it pricks your professional pride. State your case, if you please, with precision." Lestrade's thin face lengthened. "It is the precision that's against us. The gates of the garden in the middle of the square were locked last night by the keeper at 9 o'clock, and they were not open this morning till a little after 8. The snow fell without intermission through the night, drifted in places as high as your knee, and the surface within the railings was unbroken when the constable passed at 7:30. Yet at 9:15 a gloved hand was seen sticking out of a drift beside the statue of the Duke, and upon digging they found the body of a gentleman in evening dress lying upon his back, half buried in the snow, with no mark to show how he came there. No footprints near him, no trail to the gate, no cart ruts at the rails, nothing but a white sheet and a dead man to make you doubt your senses." Holmes's head came round at that, the languor gone from his face as the cloud passes and the sun is revealed. "You interest me, Lestrade. Pray continue." "We had him carried at once to the watch-house. He was not quite dead when they found him. A surgeon from Wigmore Street was sent for, and they forced a little brandy between his teeth. He opened his eyes and tried to speak, but his lips were blue, and he chattered like a man in a fever. The surgeon says the exposure and some shock together were the end of him. He did get out one thing. 2 words, no more. Return it. Then he fell back, and by the time I got there, he was gone. Return it, murmured Holmes, as if testing the weight of the syllables. To whom? What? Your dead man did not help you by naming either. What have you as to his identity? That adds to the tangle, said Lestrade, plucking uneasily at his glove. He wore excellent clothes, dress coat, white waistcoat, proper tie, though handled as if by an amateur, patent shoes with a welt you don't often see in England, and a silk hat found 3 yards away under a laurel. No overcoat. His linen was good and marked on the cuff, S.T., in red thread. In his pocket-book were 5 sovereigns, some silver, a theatre stall ticket for last night at the Lyceum, and 2 visiting cards with the name Mr. Percival Hartley, Montague Street. There was also a lady's card, Mrs. Georgina Vale, the Larches, Sydenham, and a return railway ticket to Woking. But the man is no Percival Hartley known to any in Montague Street. And there's no Mr. Hartley at that number. We have telegraphed to Woking and sent to Sydenham. There is nothing else that gives us a hold. No watch? Asked Holmes. There's the mark of a chain across his waistcoat and a little smear of oil or black stuff at the buttonhole where the T-bar would have gone through, but no watch, no chain. His right hand was bare and very much marked with cold, and there's a white ring on the finger where a ring has been taken off rather than slipped. A smear of black at the buttonhole, said Holmes, his eyes half closed. Ring removed from an insensible hand. And what else? There was a tiny splinter of blue glass inside the left glove, which was wet through and clotted upon the palm with snow. The surgeon took it out. He says he's seen such glass in scent bottles, and the body had a smell, very slight, like wintergreen. Some liniment, perhaps. And there was a crushed flower in the buttonhole. Violet, Mr. Holmes. It had been pinned there, but the pin was gone. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, one hand upon the shutter, his profile keen and gaunt, thrown into relief by the glow of the fire behind him. You have taken what measures, Lestrade? The body is at the mortuary. I have left a man at the square to keep off the curious. We have the keeper at the station, and the constable who passed at 7:30. I have sent a sergeant to the Lyceum to learn if the fellow was seen there last night. Holmes's long hand described one of those little movements which were with him as expressive as speech. You have done well. It is a case which has certain elements native to London and others which are not. Watson, your coat. We shall need our feet more than our heads for the next hour. There is no spectacle so edifying as a contradiction, said Holmes with a trace of that sardonic humour which endeared and exasperated him by turns. You assure me that your square was a sheet of paper unmarked by ink, yet someone has written upon it a name in large characters it would be stupid of us not to read. A quarter of an hour later, we were clattering through the pale streets in a four-wheeler, the windows starred upon the inside, and the world beyond reduced to a succession of ghostly forms that loomed and vanished. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin sunk upon the breast of his ulster, and his hands in his sleeves, as motionless as a figure carved from ice. Only once did he stir, to draw from his pocket the fragment of blue glass which Lestrade had entrusted to him, hold it to the light, turn it once, and slip it back without a word. For my part, I confess that the inspector's narrative had excited my imagination considerably. I could picture the white expanse within the iron rails, the black figure rigid against its pall, the absurd, menacing stillness of London under its fall of snow. The 2 words of the dying man repeated themselves in my ears with persistent monotony. Return what? To whom? And by what agency had a living man been laid upon a couch of snow within a circle of iron, while the storm itself bore witness for the assassin? As for Holmes, I felt that peculiar mixture of confidence and curiosity, of awe and amusement which any man must feel who has been privileged to see that remarkable brain address itself to a problem worthy of it. In the depth of winter, when the town lay buried, and men crept like mice in their own passages, it seemed that we were about to unearth not merely a body, but a design. The snow had ceased falling by the time our four-wheeler drew up at Cavendish Square, though the leaden sky promised more to come. The square itself lay hushed under its white mantle, the grand Georgian houses standing like silent sentinels, while a thin crowd of onlookers gathered at respectful distance from the iron railings. Holmes alighted with that sudden energy which marked his transition from contemplation to action, his keen eyes already scanning the scene with the methodical attention of a general studying a battlefield. Lestrade emerged from the garden gate as we approached, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "Nothing new to report, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector. "The keeper has been most cooperative. William Pembridge, 23 years at his post, swears the gates were secured at 9 o'clock precisely and no soul passed through them after that hour." Holmes paused at the gate, his gloved hands grasping the iron bars as he surveyed the interior. The garden was perhaps 50 yards square, containing the usual complement of bare trees and gravel paths arranged around a central statue. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, save where the morning's activities had created a trampled circle near the monument. "The keeper," said Holmes without turning his head. "I should like a word with him." Pembridge was produced within moments, a grizzled fellow whose weathered face bore the stamp of long service. "Never a day's trouble till this morning, sir," he said with evident distress. "I lock up at 9 sharp every evening and open at 8 in the morning. Been my way for 23 years and I've never varied it by so much as 5 minutes. The garden was empty as a church when I made my final round." Holmes examined the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass, running his fingers along the iron bars. "These railings, what is their height?" 7 feet, sir, with spikes atop. Built to keep out the roughs. A man would need to be uncommonly athletic to scale them, and even then he'd likely do himself a mischief." We passed through the gate into the garden, our feet crunching in the crisp snow. Holmes moved with deliberate pace, his eyes fixed upon the ground, occasionally stopping to examine some minute detail. The monument itself depicted some forgotten worthy in conventional civic dignity, and at its base the snow had drifted considerably, forming natural hollows that would indeed have provided concealment for a recumbent figure. Holmes dropped to one knee beside the depression where the body had lain. "Watson, observe this impression. The depth suggests a weight of some 16 stone, but note the edges, particularly at what would have been the head and shoulders. The snow has been compressed not merely by weight, but by movement. This man struggled. He was alive when he came to rest here." He moved to the railings and examined the spear-headed tops with intense focus. There, upon the 3rd spike from the corner, I saw him lift a minute thread with his penknife, dark and glossy, which he placed carefully in an envelope. Just below, on the bar itself, was a dull, greasy trace that had resisted the frost. "Your men did not lean here?" he asked sharply. "Not one, Mr. Holmes," Pembridge protested. "They came straight by the gate to the spot." Holmes crossed to the statue and tapped the plinth lightly, his eyes measuring the height, the distance to the railings, the span of clear air above. With his hand he brushed across the drift where it had been cut by the spade, revealing a faint, shallow groove running not quite straight, but with a sag in the middle. He followed it to the very edge of the bed, and there lost it. He crouched again and brought forth from the trampled snow a second splinter of blue glass, comparing it to Lestrade's specimen. He sniffed the air, then the cuff of his glove after rubbing it along the plinth's surface. "You remarked wintergreen, Lestrade. Your surgeon was not mistaken. It clings." "Then the man had rubbed himself," the inspector suggested. "A cold night would drive anyone to it." "Anyone acquainted with the properties of methyl salicylate," Holmes returned dryly. He straightened, his gaze returning to the rail-tops. "It is not in every household." He bent to examine the gate's lock once more, peering within and glancing at the lintel, upon which a minute smear of brownish substance showed, no larger than a midge's wing. "Who has boats in Cavendish Square?" he asked, with a slight smile that made Lestrade shift uncomfortably. "Boats? You're having sport with me, Mr. Holmes?" "Possibly. And yet where there is marine varnish in a place where no boat should be, there is at least a question to be answered." Holmes dusted the snow from his gloves with satisfaction. "We have learned what we could hear. The snow has been most eloquent, though it speaks a language few are trained to understand. Come, let us see what the dead man himself may tell us." The mortuary stood in a narrow street off Marylebone Road, its grey stone facade begrimed with years of London soot, and its windows filmed with the morning's frost. The attendant, a cadaverous fellow whose profession seemed to have leached the warmth from his very bones, led us through corridors that echoed with our footsteps to a small chamber where the unknown gentleman lay upon a marble slab. The cold here possessed a quality beyond that of the winter streets, carrying with it that peculiar stillness which belongs to places where the living seldom tarry. Holmes approached the body with the detached interest of a naturalist examining a rare specimen, while Lestrade hovered nearby, notebook at the ready. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, of medium height and build, with dark hair showing premature silver at the temples. His features, though now bearing the pallor of death, suggested a life of comfort rather than hardship. Drawing back the sheet, Holmes began his examination with methodical precision. "Observe, Watson, the evening dress. Excellent quality, yet something is amiss." He indicated the white tie, which sat slightly askew. "A gentleman of evident means, yet the tie is knotted with the clumsiness of a schoolboy. Either he dressed in considerable haste, or these are not his customary garments." From the inside pocket of the dress coat, Holmes withdrew a small leather notebook, its pages dampened by snow but still legible. The entries were sparse, written in a careful hand, consisting mainly of appointments and addresses. One entry, dated 3 days previous, immediately caught our attention. "Jeeve, final arrangements, 8 o'clock. "Mrs. Georgina Vale," murmured Lestrade, "the lady whose card was found upon him." Holmes nodded absently, his attention now fixed upon the waistcoat. Where the watch chain should have attached, the fabric showed not only the oil stain previously noted, but a small tear, as though the chain had been removed with violence. He examined the mark more closely with his magnifying glass. Not oil, Lestrade, but graphite residue, the sort left by an old or poorly maintained timepiece. Curious that a man of such apparent refinement should carry so inferior a watch. The hands revealed their own secrets under Holmes's scrutiny. The fingernails were clean and well kept, suggesting sedentary habits, yet the right hand bore traces of a dark, varnish-like substance. From his pocket, Holmes produced the thread he had recovered from the railings and compared it to fibres clinging to the coat sleeve. "Marine varnish," he announced with satisfaction. "And this thread? Canvas fibre, the sort found on ship's rigging or dockside tarpaulins." He lifted the dress coat and examined the tailor's label with keen interest. "H. Bosworth and Company, Tremont Street. American manufacture, Watson. Our friend is no Londoner, despite his cards claiming residence in Montague Street. The shoes, too, bore the distinctive welting of American craftsmanship, their soles crusted with a mixture of salt and mica-flecked dust that spoke of riverside wharves. From the trouser pocket, Holmes extracted a small brass key, well worn and slightly bent. "German manufacture?" he observed, noting the maker's mark. "The bend suggests recent forcing. Someone was in considerable haste to open whatever this secured." The body itself revealed little beyond what the police surgeon had noted, save for a tiny puncture wound behind the left ear, so minute as to be nearly invisible. "A hat pin," Holmes murmured, "or something similar. Not fatal, but sufficient to render a man insensible." As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused to examine once more the crushed violet that had adorned the buttonhole. "Broken against a hard edge," he observed, "and the pin removed. Yet violets in January, Watson. Hothouse flowers, expensive and carefully tended." In the hansom returning to Baker Street, Holmes sat in contemplative silence before speaking. We have a man of American origins, carrying false English credentials, dressed in evening clothes not his own, bearing traces of maritime activity and connected somehow to Mrs. Georgina Vale. The notebook suggests a final meeting, the missing watch and ring indicate selective theft, and the wintergreen points to medical treatment or perhaps concealment of other odours. He tapped his fingers against his knee in that characteristic rhythm which indicated rapid mental calculation. The theatre ticket remains our most promising lead. A man does not attend Hamlet alone on his final evening without purpose. Come, Watson, let us see what the Lyceum may tell us of our mysterious American and his appointment with death. The afternoon was drawing in as we alighted at the theatre district, the gas lamps beginning to flicker to life in the gathering dusk. Whatever secrets lay buried with our gentleman in the snow, I felt certain that the stage which had witnessed his last public appearance would yet yield the key to unlock them. The Lyceum Theatre stood against the darkening sky like a beacon of warmth in the bitter evening, its gas-lit façade casting golden pools upon the snow-dusted pavement. The last stragglers from the afternoon rehearsals were departing as we approached, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Holmes paused at the entrance, examining the playbills with that peculiar intensity he brought to bear upon even the most mundane details, before approaching the doorkeeper, who was securing the brass fittings against the night. "We are investigating on behalf of Scotland Yard," Holmes announced, producing the theatre ticket from his waistcoat. "Seat D18, last evening's performance. The gentleman who occupied it has met with an unfortunate end." The doorkeeper, a stout fellow whose years of service had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of theatrical patrons, examined the ticket with interest. Ah, yes, the American gentleman, nervous sort, kept checking his pocket watch and glancing about as though expecting someone, arrived just before curtain, which struck me as odd for a man of evident refinement. Most gentlemen of his class arrive with time to spare for the social amenities. Holmes leaned forward with renewed attention. "American, you say? You are certain of this?" "Oh, yes, sir. The accent was unmistakable once you knew what to listen for, though he tried to disguise it. Asked particular questions about the building's layout, the exits, whether there were private rooms available. Said he might have need of discretion for a business meeting." We were directed to the box office where the clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, consulted his ledgers with nervous efficiency. "The ticket was purchased 3 days ago by a gentleman giving the name Hartley, paid in cash, insisted upon that particular seat, said he required a clear view of both the stage and the main entrance." From there we proceeded to interview the ushers, and it was young Timothy, a sharp-eyed lad with the observational skills of his profession, who provided our most illuminating intelligence. The gentleman left during the second interval, sir, which surprised me. Most patrons stay for Mr. Irving's final scenes, but he seemed agitated, kept dabbing at his brow with his handkerchief despite the cold. Just before he departed, I saw him speaking with a lady near the cloakroom. "Describe this lady," Holmes commanded. "Handsome woman, sir, well dressed in dark blue velvet with a muff of the same material. She wore violets pinned to her collar, and the scent was quite strong. They spoke in hushed tones, but I caught a few words as I passed. Something about the arrangement being discovered, and it must be returned tonight." The lady seemed distressed, kept wringing her gloved hands. Holmes's eyes brightened with that peculiar gleam which indicated a significant connection had been made. We sought out the cloakroom attendant, a sharp-featured woman who proved equally observant. "Indeed, I remember them both," she declared. "The lady had been in earlier, asking if a Mr. Hartley was expected. She seemed particularly anxious about meeting him. During their conversation, she opened a small blue bottle to dab her kerchief, but her hands were shaking so that it slipped and shattered upon the floor. The smell was not pleasant, sharp and medicinal, like wintergreen liniment. I swept up the pieces, though some may have scattered." Holmes produced the glass fragments from his pocket, comparing them to the woman's description. "And after their conversation?" "The gentleman left alone, sir, but not before the lady pressed something into his hand. A key, I believe, though I cannot be certain. She remained for some minutes after, pacing about in considerable agitation, before departing by the stage door rather than the main entrance. Our final interview was with the stage doorkeeper, who provided the missing piece of our puzzle. "Aye, the lady left by my door, but she wasn't alone when she went. There was a rough fellow waiting for her in the alley, seafaring man by his look, with tar on his sleeves and the smell of rope about him. They had words, heated ones, though they kept their voices low. I heard him say something about the thing being back where it belongs by midnight, or there'd be blood to pay. The lady seemed frightened of him, kept glancing about as though expecting pursuit." Holmes drew me aside as we prepared to leave. "The pattern emerges, Watson. Our American friend was caught between two forces, Mrs. Vale, who wished something returned, and this sailor, who demanded its restoration. The key pressed into his hand, the maritime evidence upon his person, the wintergreen used perhaps to mask other odours, all point to a carefully orchestrated crime with nautical connections. But how does this explain his presence in the locked garden?" Holmes smiled that enigmatic smile which indicated he had formed a theory but was not yet ready to share it. "Patience, my dear fellow. First, we must visit Mrs. Georgina Vale in Sydenham. I suspect that lady holds more secrets than she has yet revealed." The journey to Sydenham proved arduous through the snow-laden streets, our hansom making slow progress as the winter evening deepened around us. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, occasionally consulting his pocket watch with that peculiar intensity which suggested he was calculating not merely time, but the intricate choreography of human motives. The gas lamps flickered to life as we passed through the suburban thoroughfares, casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets we pursued. The larches stood behind a screen of bare elm trees, a substantial villa whose windows glowed warmly against the gathering darkness. Yet something in its very respectability struck me as theatrical, as though the scene had been carefully arranged for our inspection. The snow upon the drive showed recent disturbance, and the footprints leading to the entrance bore that peculiar irregularity which speaks of emotional distress rather than purposeful movement. Our knock was answered by a parlour-maid, whose red-rimmed eyes and nervous manner suggested that tragedy had already cast its shadow over this household. She led us through a hall adorned with maritime paintings and ship models, to a drawing room where Mrs. Georgina Vale awaited us beside a cheerful fire that seemed to mock the chill of our investigation. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, handsome in the conventional manner, with dark hair arranged fashionably and a complexion that spoke of careful attention to social proprieties. Her gown of dark blue velvet matched exactly the usher's description from the Lyceum, and though no violets adorned her person, their sweet perfume seemed to linger in the air about her. Yet her composure was clearly maintained by supreme effort of will, for her hands trembled slightly as she rose to greet us, and there was about her eyes that haunted look which comes from sleepless nights and guilty knowledge. "Gentlemen," she said, in a voice carefully modulated despite its underlying strain, "I have been expecting you since learning of poor Mr. Hartley's fate. Such a dreadful end to what should have been a simple business arrangement." Holmes settled himself in the indicated chair, his penetrating gaze never leaving her face. "You knew him well, then, this Mr. Hartley?" "Not well, no. He was recommended as a gentleman who might assist in recovering certain property that had gone astray. We had corresponded briefly, and yesterday evening was to be our first meeting." "At the Lyceum Theatre," Holmes observed. "An unusual venue for business discussions, particularly given the key you pressed into his hand during your conversation." The effect of his words was immediate and startling. Mrs. Vale's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice beneath a sudden weight, and she half rose from her chair before sinking back with a barely suppressed gasp. Holmes produced the bent brass key from his waistcoat, holding it so that the firelight caught its worn surface. "German manufacture, recently forced. Mr. Hartley died with this in his possession, Mrs. Vale. Perhaps you would care to explain its significance?" For a long moment she stared at the key as though it were a serpent coiled to strike, then her shoulders sagged in defeat. "I had no choice," she whispered. "The arrangement had been discovered. There were threats made, terrible threats against my person and my reputation." "What manner of threats, madam?" Mrs. Vale rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the snow-covered garden as though seeking escape from her memories. "My late husband, Captain Vale, was not merely a merchant seaman, Mr. Holmes. During his final voyage he became involved in certain activities of a questionable nature. Before his death he entrusted me with evidence of these activities, documents that could ruin several prominent men if they became public knowledge. And this evidence? Contained within a chronometer case secured by that very key. After the captain's death, it was stolen by a man who had served under him, a brute who calls himself Black Jack. He has been using the documents for purposes of extortion, demanding money from those whose names appear in my husband's records." Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "You engaged Mr. Hartley to recover this chronometer?" "I could no longer bear the shame of it, Mr. Holmes. Black Jack came here yesterday afternoon, before I left for the theatre. He had discovered my arrangement with Mr. Hartley and was furious. He threatened that if the chronometer was not returned to him by midnight, there would be consequences I would regret for the remainder of my days." "Yet you gave Hartley the key nonetheless?" "I begged him to abandon the enterprise, but he was determined to complete what he had undertaken. The last I saw of him was when he left the theatre, and I feared then that I had sent him to his death." Holmes rose, his eyes sweeping the room with that methodical attention which missed nothing of significance. Near the conservatory door, I observed, lay a coil of hemp rope and what appeared to be traces of marine varnish upon the oak flooring, details that did not escape my companion's notice. "We shall not trespass longer upon your hospitality, Mrs. Vale," said Holmes, though his tone suggested the interview had yielded precisely what he had hoped to discover. "You will remain available should we require further assistance?" "I dare not leave the house," she murmured, her eyes darting nervously toward the darkened windows. As we departed into the bitter night, I felt that every step drew us deeper into a web of deception whose center remained tantalizingly beyond our reach, yet whose outline was beginning to emerge with increasing clarity in Holmes's remarkable mind. The journey back to Baker Street proved a study in contrasts, the warmth of our enclosed hansom offering sanctuary from the bitter night, while Holmes's mind worked with that peculiar intensity I had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. The rhythmic clatter of wheels upon frozen cobblestones provided a steady counterpoint to the storm of deduction I could sense building behind his aquiline features. Only when we had regained the familiar comfort of our lodgings, with Mrs. Hudson's fire crackling cheerfully and the gas lamps casting their golden glow upon the familiar chaos of his chemical apparatus, did he finally break his contemplative silence. "Mrs. Vale's narrative contains sufficient truth to be useful," he began, settling into his chair with that satisfaction which indicated a problem approaching resolution. "Yet it is interwoven with deception so artful as to suggest considerable practice in the art. Did you observe, Watson, the rope and marine varnish in her drawing-room? Such equipment serves no purpose in a suburban villa unless it fulfills some specific function in our drama." Holmes rose and began that restless pacing which invariably accompanied his most intensive periods of reasoning. "The central question remains unchanged. How does a man materialize within a locked garden surrounded by pristine snow? The laws of physics are not suspended for the convenience of criminals, however ingenious their schemes may be." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon her silver tray. Holmes tore it open with eager fingers, his expression growing increasingly animated as he absorbed its contents. "Excellent," he exclaimed. "Lestrade's inquiry to Woking has borne remarkable fruit. There is indeed a gentleman named Hartley, registered at the Railway Hotel, but he departed yesterday morning for London, leaving his luggage and settling his account in advance. However, the hotel register reveals our corpse's true identity, one Samuel Thornton of Boston, Massachusetts. Our Mr. Thornton appears to have appropriated both Hartley's name and London address for purposes of concealment." "Then the Percival Hartley identity was entirely fabricated?" "Not fabricated, Watson, but borrowed. The real Hartley exists but travels currently on the continent." This revelation illuminates much. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, retrieving the bent brass key and examining it once more. "Consider the evidence we have assembled. Thornton leaves the theatre with this key, presumably to retrieve the chronometer from wherever Blackjack has concealed it. He encounters resistance. The puncture wound behind his ear suggests a swift blow to render him insensible rather than kill outright. The watch and ring are removed, not for their value, but to suggest common robbery." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar fire of approaching triumph. "But the true mystery, Watson, lies not in the crime itself, but in its aftermath. How does an unconscious man appear within a locked garden, surrounded by unbroken snow?" He moved to the window, gazing out at the swirling flakes. "The answer lies in the evidence we discovered at Cavendish Square. The dull, greasy trace upon the gate bar, the thread of canvas caught upon the spike, the shallow groove in the snow leading from the body toward the railings, all point to a single, elegant solution, which is, our victim was not dropped from above but slid across the snow surface. The body, wrapped in canvas, hence the marine varnish and fibre evidence, was drawn over the gate using ropes and pulleys. Blackjack's maritime experience would make such an operation elementary. The bent key suggests not that Thornton forced the chronometer case, but that someone used it to open the garden gate, which was then carefully resecured. Holmes turned from the window, his face illuminated by the solution's clarity. The purpose was to create an impossible mystery, to suggest supernatural agency and thus divert suspicion from the true perpetrators. Thornton likely died not from violence but from exposure, abandoned in the snow to perish while his killers escaped with their prize. I felt that familiar thrill which accompanied Holmes's most brilliant deductions. Then we must find this blackjack before he realizes his deception has been penetrated. Precisely. And we know exactly where such a man must go to ground. Holmes consulted his watch. "The docks, Watson. Men of blackjack's stamp invariably gravitate toward the Thames when they find themselves in London, and there are only so many establishments that cater to their particular needs." Within the hour we found ourselves threading through the maze of narrow streets surrounding the London docks, where the smell of tar and hemp mingled with less savoury odours in the frigid night air. The snow continued falling, muffling our footsteps, as Holmes led me through passages designed to confound the unwary. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the swirling flakes, casting pools of yellow light that only emphasized the surrounding darkness. Holmes paused before a low-roofed establishment whose cracked sign proclaimed it the Anchor and Chain. Through the frosted windows we could observe shadowy figures hunched over tables, and from within came the sound of rough voices raised in conversation, punctuated by occasional bursts of coarse laughter. "Follow my lead, Watson," Holmes murmured, adjusting his collar and adopting that subtle alteration of posture which could transform him from consulting detective to dockside labourer. "Keep your hand near your revolver," if Mrs. Vale spoke truthfully. "We are about to encounter a man for whom violence is merely another tool of trade." The tavern's interior assaulted our senses with its combination of unwashed humanity, stale beer, and acrid tobacco smoke. In the far corner, hunched over a table littered with empty glasses, sat a figure whose massive shoulders and weathered features immediately proclaimed his maritime origins. The man's hands bore the distinctive stains of tar and ropework, while his clothing carried the unmistakable aroma of the sea. This, I felt certain, was our blackjack, and the evening's most dangerous encounter lay immediately before us. The acrid atmosphere of the Anchor and Chain enveloped us like a physical presence as we crossed the threshold, the mingled odours of stale ale, unwashed humanity, and tar-soaked rope creating an olfactory map of London's maritime underworld. Holmes moved with that peculiar fluidity which marked his assumption of character, his shoulders adopting the rolling gait of a man accustomed to shifting decks, while his keen eyes swept the room with deceptive casualness. Blackjack occupied the corner table as we had anticipated, his massive frame hunched over a pewter tankard, engaged in low conversation with two equally disreputable companions. The man was a study in maritime brutality, broad shoulders straining against a canvas jacket, hands bearing the distinctive rope burns of his profession, and a face weathered by decades of salt spray and violence. A faded anchor tattoo adorned his left forearm, while his small, calculating eyes missed nothing of significance in his domain. Holmes selected a table within earshot, but not so close as to appear threatening, signalling for ale with the practised gesture of a regular patron. He allowed several minutes to pass in apparent indifference, occasionally remarking upon the weather or the quality of the establishment's offerings before beginning his careful campaign of revelation. "Bitter night for honest work," he observed, his voice carrying just enough to reach the corner table. "Though some business cannot wait for fair weather, particularly when certain property has gone astray from its rightful owners." Blackjack's conversation faltered imperceptibly, though his weathered features showed no outward sign of interest. Holmes continued his seemingly innocent commentary while I maintained the appearance of a companion seeking nothing more than warmth and refreshment. "Heard tell of a chronometer," Holmes continued in the same conversational tone. "One with a peculiar German key. Valuable piece, not for its timekeeping qualities, but for what it contained within. Amazing how such small objects can carry such weighty secrets." The effect upon Black Jack was immediate, though carefully controlled. His massive hands tightened around his tankard, and his eyes flicked toward us with predatory assessment. After a moment's consideration, he dismissed his companions with a curt nod and approached our table with surprising grace for one of his bulk. "You'd be asking after me, then," he growled, his voice roughened by years of shouting orders above ocean gales. "Though I'm particular about who I discuss business with, what manner of interest might you have in chronometers and German keys?" Holmes met his gaze with steady composure. "Only the interest of a man who appreciates ingenious solutions to difficult problems. The problem, for instance, of how a living man might appear within a locked garden, surrounded by pristine snow, with no footprints to mark his passage." Black Jack's eyes narrowed dangerously, and I felt my hand move instinctively toward the revolver concealed beneath my coat. "I know nothing of dead men or locked gardens," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Indeed," Holmes replied with that maddening calm which so often preceded his most dramatic revelations. "Yet I have it on excellent authority that you possess considerable expertise with ropes and pulleys, maritime equipment, one might say, particularly useful for moving heavy objects across seemingly impossible barriers." The sailor's face flushed with anger, but Holmes pressed his advantage with surgical precision. "A spar across the gatehead, canvas beneath the body to prevent marking the snow, and a haul that would challenge any landsman. Elementary seamanship, really, for a man of your experience." Black Jack slammed his fist upon the table, making the glasses jump. "You know too much, stranger, far too much for your own good." "I know that you were hired by a gentleman of refinement," Holmes continued imperturbably, "a man with soft hands and a woman's voice, who paid you handsomely to recover certain documents from an American named Thornton, documents that Captain Vale had entrusted to his widow, documents containing names that certain parties would pay handsomely to suppress." The admission hung in the smoky air like an accusation. Black Jack's hand moved towards something concealed beneath his coat, his sailor's instincts warning him of treacherous waters ahead. "The toff what hired me," he snarled. "He said the Yank would be breathing when we left him. Said the wintergreen would keep him comfortable till morning. I never meant murder." "Number 14, Holmes said quietly. "Valentine Wharf. The tokens of your employment, I believe." Black Jack's face went white with sudden, dawning comprehension. Through the tavern's grimy windows I glimpsed the approaching glow of police lanterns and knew that our most dangerous encounter was about to begin. Black Jack's weathered features contorted with sudden, desperate fury as the approaching police lanterns cast their wavering light through the tavern's grimy windows. The revelation that his secret warehouse had been discovered struck him like a physical blow, and his massive hand moved instinctively toward the knife concealed beneath his canvas jacket. The blade emerged with practiced swiftness, its worn handle speaking of long familiarity with violence, but Holmes was already in motion. With that peculiar economy of movement which marked his moments of greatest danger, Holmes tipped our table forward, sending pewter tankards and ale cascading across the sawdust floor. Black Jack stumbled against the improvised barrier, his knife thrust going wide, while I sprang to my feet with my revolver drawn. The tavern erupted in chaos as other patrons scrambled for the rear exit, their instincts warning them of impending official attention. The door burst inward with sudden violence, admitting Inspector Lestrade and two constables whose heavy boots thundered across the wooden floor. "In the Queen's name!" Lestrade shouted, his voice cutting through the din of overturned furniture and shouted curses. Black Jack, recovering his balance with surprising agility for one of his bulk, lunged again at Holmes with murderous intent. Holmes sidestepped the attack with the fluid grace of a trained swordsman, simultaneously grasping a walking stick from the umbrella stand near the door. A sharp rap across Black Jack's wrist sent the knife spinning into the shadows, while a constable closed from behind. The struggle was brief but violent, ending with the sailor pinned beneath the combined weight of both officers, his massive frame heaving with exhausted rage. "Took your time, Lestrade," Holmes observed with characteristic calm, his breathing scarcely elevated despite the recent exertion. Though I suspect our friend here was about to provide some illuminating testimony regarding his recent activities. Black Jack glared up from the floor, his eyes blazing with impotent fury. "You set me up, you devil!" he snarled through gritted teeth. "But I'll not hang for any gentleman's game. The toff what hired me, he said the American would be breathing come morning, said the wintergreen rub would keep him comfortable through the night." Holmes leaned forward with renewed interest. "Describe this employer more precisely, his appearance, manner of speech, any distinguishing characteristics." "Medium height, well-dressed, in the fashion of quality folk," Black Jack muttered, as the manacles clicked into place. "Hands soft as a woman's, voice cultured, but with something foreign underneath. Wore expensive gloves throughout our meeting, and his eyes were cold as winter fog. Met me at a private room 3 nights past, knew things about my past voyages with Captain Vale that no honest gentleman should know." As the constables hauled their prisoner to his feet, Black Jack's expression shifted from defiance to something approaching grudging respect. "There's something you should know," he said quietly to Holmes. "Valentine Wharf, number 14. That's where we did the business. The toff collected his prize not 2 hours past, but he left evidence behind, ropes, canvas, the whole apparatus, and there's a watchman what saw more than he should have. Within minutes, we were clattering through the snow-laden streets toward the Thames, our hansom making treacherous progress over the ice-slicked cobblestones." Holmes sat in contemplative silence, occasionally consulting his pocket watch with that peculiar intensity which suggested he was calculating not merely time, but the complex choreography of criminal enterprise. Valentine Wharf lay in a crooked reach where the Thames, slowed by the bitter cold, lapped sluggishly against the frost-covered timbers. Number 14 proved to be a low warehouse of weathered brick, its pitched roof white with accumulated snow. A single lantern glowed at the side door, casting a pool of yellow light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the surrounding darkness. The warehouse interior revealed the apparatus of our mystery with startling clarity. A pulley had been rigged upon a central beam, with lengths of new hemp rope still threaded through the mechanism. Beneath it lay a canvas sheet, stiff with freezing moisture and marked with dark stains that spoke of recent use. On a nearby trestle stood an open brass-bound case bearing the distinctive German lock we had observed, its interior now empty of whatever secrets it had once contained. Holmes examined the scene with a methodical precision, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. From the canvas he lifted a tiny purple petal, crushed into the weave. "Violet," he murmured, comparing it to similar evidence from our earlier investigations. And here, upon the trestle, traces of that same wintergreen liniment. A low moan from the shadowed recesses made us start. Holmes was there in an instant, his lantern illuminating the pale, frightened face of a bound watchman whose cap sat askew and whose eyes rolled with terror. The man bore a small puncture wound behind his left ear, identical to that found upon our corpse. We quickly freed the fellow and revived him with water from a nearby cask. His testimony, gasped between chattering teeth, proved illuminating. 2 men had entered with a key, conducting their business with practiced efficiency. One was young and slight, the other spoke with the cultured tones of a gentleman and wore expensive clothing including a fur collar that the watchman described as smooth as a cat. Holmes's eyes sharpened at this detail. "Astrakhan," he murmured, producing the dark thread he had recovered from the garden railings. "The same distinctive fibre, Watson. Our mysterious employer left more traces than he realized." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the river door, noting the ice splinters on the wooden step and the smear of varnish upon what had once been a boat's gunwale. "They departed by water," he announced with sudden urgency, "but a man of such evident refinement will not rest easy while witnesses remain who might betray him." His face grew grim with realization. "Mrs. Vale, Watson, she knows too much, and our mysterious gentleman will not suffer such a liability to survive. We must reach Sydenham with all possible speed, or I fear we shall find ourselves investigating a second murder before this night is through." The game had indeed reached its most dangerous phase, and time was no longer our ally in the race against a killer who had already demonstrated both cunning and ruthless determination. The urgency in Holmes's voice spurred our driver to greater efforts, his whip cracking through the bitter air as our hansom careened through the snow-choked streets towards Sydenham. The wheels threw up cascades of icy slush, while Holmes sat rigid with tension, his gloved hands gripping his walking stick as he stared into the swirling darkness beyond our frost-starred windows. Every delay, a milk cart blocking our passage, a fallen tree branch requiring navigation, seemed to stretch his nerves tighter, like violin strings approaching their breaking point. "The pieces have been before us from the beginning, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of hooves. The soft hands, the woman's voice that Blackjack noted, the theatrical nature of that meeting at the Lyceum, the wintergreen used to mask a more distinctive scent. We have been pursuing shadows while the substance stood directly before us, playing the role of victim with consummate skill. As we rounded the final corner into the street where the larches stood, Holmes leaned forward with sudden intensity. The villa's windows no longer glowed with their earlier warmth, save for a single dim light in an upper chamber that flickered uncertainly against the drawn curtains. Fresh tracks in the snow led from the gate to the entrance, but these were not the measured steps of a casual visitor. They showed the irregular pattern of struggle of someone moving under duress or in great haste. Holmes was out of the hansom before it had fully stopped, his keen eyes already cataloguing the scene. The front door stood ajar, revealing a dark mouth that seemed to exhale the chill of more than winter air. Upon the threshold lay scattered fragments of blue glass, and the astrakhan fibres we had traced throughout our investigation clung to the doorframe like accusatory evidence. We entered with utmost caution, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the hallway. The drawing room where we had interviewed Mrs. Vale presented a scene of considerable disorder, overturned furniture, scattered papers, and near the conservatory door a dark stain upon the Persian rug that spoke of recent violence. Yet it was not the chaos that arrested Holmes's attention, but rather the careful arrangement of certain details that suggested deliberate staging rather than genuine struggle. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, kneeling beside an overturned chair. "The furniture has been displaced with method, not fury. See how this table has been moved precisely to block the direct path to the conservatory, yet the valuable ornaments upon it remain unbroken. This is theatre, not genuine conflict. From the conservatory came a faint sound, not quite a groan, but the rustle of fabric against glass. Holmes moved toward it with that peculiar combination of stealth and certainty that marked his most dangerous moments. There, among the frost-withered plants, we discovered Mrs. Vale herself, her elegant gown torn and stained, a small wound upon her shoulder that had bled freely enough to appear serious without being truly dangerous. Her eyes, when they opened at our approach, held not the gratitude of a rescued victim, but the calculating assessment of a player whose performance had been interrupted. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice carrying just the right note of weakness and relief. "Thank heavens you have come." He returned, the man who hired that dreadful sailor. He demanded the chronometer's contents, and when I refused, Holmes's expression remained impassive as he examined the scene more closely. From the broken glass of the conservatory window, he retrieved a fragment of dark fur, astrakhan, identical to the threads we had found at Cavendish Square. But it was not this discovery that brought that familiar gleam of triumph to his eyes, but rather a small detail that would have escaped any observer less acute. "Your glove, Mrs. Vale?" he said quietly, indicating her left hand. "You wear only one. The other, I believe, was lost during your recent performance." From his pocket he produced the elegant kid glove we had discovered at the warehouse, its cuff trimmed with the same astrakhan fur. Mrs. Vale's eyes widened, and for a moment her carefully maintained facade cracked like ice beneath sudden pressure. "The wintergreen liniment," Holmes continued with inexorable logic, "was not applied to our unfortunate Mr. Thornton for his comfort, but rather to mask the distinctive violet perfume that has been your signature throughout this affair. The gentleman with soft hands and a cultured voice that Black Jack described was no man at all, but rather a woman of considerable theatrical ability." Mrs. Vale's composure finally shattered completely. "You cannot prove such wild accusations," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier weakness and taken on a harder edge that revealed the steel beneath her feminine facade. "Can I not?" Holmes smiled with grim satisfaction. "The chronometer case contained not your husband's papers, but rather something far more valuable, stolen naval documents that Captain Vale had appropriated during his final voyage. You hired Black Jack not to recover them, but to eliminate the one man who could expose your role in their theft. Mr. Thornton had discovered your secret and demanded their return, threatening to expose you to the authorities. The full scope of Mrs. Vale's deception was now laid bare before us like a map of criminal enterprise. She had orchestrated every element of the plot, from the theatrical meeting at the Lyceum to the elaborate staging of Thornton's death in the locked garden. Her apparent cooperation with our investigation had been merely another performance, designed to deflect suspicion while she eliminated the evidence of her crimes. As Holmes concluded his exposition, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Lestrade's arrival with his constables. Mrs. Vale's last desperate gambit, this staged attack upon herself, had failed to deceive the one man in London whose analytical powers could penetrate even the most artful deception. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed up, and the woman who had played victim so convincingly now stood revealed as the architect of murder most ingenious. The sound of official boots upon frozen gravel announced Inspector Lestrade's arrival with his constables, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter air as they entered the disordered drawing-room. Mrs. Vale, still maintaining her pose of wounded innocence among the overturned furniture, raised her eyes with that carefully practiced expression of gratitude and relief that had served her so well throughout this elaborate deception. "Inspector Lestrade," she gasped, pressing her hand to her shoulder wound with theatrical precision, Thank heavens you have arrived. This gentleman has made the most extraordinary accusations against me, despite my being the victim of a brutal assault. Surely you cannot credit such wild theories when the evidence of violence is before your very eyes." Holmes regarded her performance with the detached interest of a critic observing a familiar play, his keen eyes noting every calculated gesture. "Inspector," he said with quiet authority, "I would ask you to place Mrs. Vale under arrest for the murder of Samuel Thornton of Boston, Massachusetts. What you see before you is not the aftermath of an attack, but rather the final act of an elaborate theatrical production." Lestrade's weathered features showed the skepticism born of long experience. "Mr. Holmes, the lady appears to have been genuinely assaulted. The wound, the disorder of the room, all carefully staged, Inspector." Holmes moved to the overturned table, indicating its precise positioning. "Observe how the furniture has been displaced with method rather than violence. This table blocks the direct path to the conservatory, yet the valuable ornaments upon it remain unbroken. The broken glass was shattered from within, not forced from without. Even the blood upon Mrs. Vale's gown, while genuine, flows from a wound that is carefully shallow, painful enough to appear serious, yet not deep enough to cause genuine harm." From his waistcoat, Holmes produced the astrakhan-trimmed glove we had discovered at Valentine Wharf. "This belongs to Mrs. Vale, Inspector. Its mate lies in her dressing-room upstairs, along with the masculine clothing she wore when hiring Black Jack. The gentleman with soft hands and a cultured voice that our sailor described was no man at all, but rather a woman of considerable theatrical ability. The effect upon Mrs. Vale was immediate and startling. Her carefully maintained facade of feminine fragility cracked like ice beneath sudden pressure, and something altogether more dangerous flickered in her eyes. Yet she made one final attempt to maintain her deception. "You have no proof of such wild accusations," she declared, though her voice had lost its earlier weakness. "These are the fantasies of a mind too eager to find complexity where simple tragedy exists." Holmes smiled with that peculiar satisfaction which marked his moments of complete triumph. "Have I not?" He moved to the pianoforte that stood against the far wall, lifting the fall and striking a single chord. The note died with a curious hollowness that immediately caught his attention. Kneeling beside the instrument, he tapped the wooden panel beneath the keyboard, then applied pressure with his penknife until it sprang open with a soft click. From the hidden compartment, Holmes withdrew a flat packet sealed in oiled brown paper, its edges carefully treated against moisture. "Inspector, I believe you will find here the stolen naval documents that have been the true motive for this entire affair. Convoy schedules, cipher tables, and correspondence bearing signatures that certain gentlemen would pay handsomely to suppress." Mrs. Vale's composure finally shattered completely. The refined lady of society vanished, replaced by something altogether more calculating and dangerous. "You meddling fool," she snarled, all pretense abandoned. "Do you have any conception of what you have destroyed? Those documents were my insurance against poverty, my protection against a world that offers women nothing but dependence upon the charity of men." Holmes regarded her with that mixture of professional satisfaction and human regret which marked his encounters with criminals of genuine intelligence. "Your husband's theft of sensitive naval documents during his final voyage was indeed profitable, Mrs. Vale, but it was Samuel Thornton's discovery of your continued use of them for extortion that sealed his fate. He had traced the documents through a network of contacts in Boston, following the trail of bribes and blackmail that had sustained you since Captain Vale's death. As the full scope of her criminal enterprise became clear, Mrs. Vale's confession came in bitter fragments, each admission torn from her by the inexorable logic of Holmes's reconstruction. She had disguised herself as a gentleman to hire Black Jack, using her theatrical skills to adopt masculine dress and mannerisms. The meeting at the Lyceum had been carefully orchestrated, a public place where she could appear to be the victim of coercion rather than its architect. The wintergreen liniment was my inspiration, she admitted with grudging pride, applied to mask the violet perfume that has been my signature throughout London society. The key I pressed into Thornton's hand was genuine. It did open the chronometer case, but I had already arranged for Black Jack to be waiting at the warehouse. Holmes nodded gravely. The rope work was Black Jack's contribution. He rigged the pulley system that allowed you to transport Thornton's unconscious body to Cavendish Square without leaving footprints in the snow. The canvas prevented marking the surface, and the careful positioning near the monument created the impression of supernatural intervention, an impossible crime that would confound investigation and deflect suspicion from any human agency. Lestrade stepped forward with the manacles, but Mrs. Vale held up her hand with something approaching her former dignity. "I will come quietly, Inspector. There is no point in further resistance." She turned to Holmes with a smile that held more admiration than hatred. "You have been a worthy opponent, Mr. Holmes. Few men could have penetrated so elaborate a deception." As the constables led her away into the swirling snow, Holmes stood in contemplative silence, his keen eyes surveying the wreckage of her carefully constructed world of lies. The conservatory, with its frost-withered plants and broken glass, seemed to embody the collapse of an intelligence that might have achieved greatness had it been directed toward honest ends. "A remarkable woman," he said quietly as we prepared to leave. Her planning was meticulous, her execution nearly flawless, and her ability to manipulate both men and circumstances was extraordinary. Had she not underestimated the significance of seemingly minor details, the astrakhan fibers, the distinctive scent, the theatrical precision of her staged performance, she might well have escaped justice entirely. The case of the gentleman buried in the snow had reached its conclusion, but as we made our way through the winter streets toward Baker Street, I knew that the memory of Mrs. Vale's elaborate deception would linger long in both our minds, a testament to the dangerous combination of intelligence and desperation that could transform even the most respectable citizen into a criminal of extraordinary cunning. The familiar comfort of our Baker Street lodgings provided welcome refuge from the night's bitter revelations as Holmes and I settled before the fire with our customary brandy. The gas lamps cast their warm glow upon the comfortable disorder of our sitting room, while outside the snow continued its silent descent upon the sleeping city. Holmes had resumed his characteristic position in the left-hand chair, his long fingers steepled before his aquiline nose as he contemplated the evening's dramatic conclusion. "A most instructive case, Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that note of professional satisfaction which marked the successful resolution of a particularly challenging problem. "It demonstrates how the most elaborate theatrical deceptions invariably founder upon the immutable laws of physical evidence. Mrs. Vale possessed remarkable intelligence and considerable dramatic ability, yet she could not account for every thread, every fibre, every trace that her masquerade would inevitably leave behind." Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece, retrieving his pipe with the deliberate care of a free man settling into familiar ritual. The astrakhan fibres were her first betrayal. Such distinctive material leaves its signature wherever it touches. The marine varnish, the canvas threads, the wintergreen masking her violet perfume. Each seemed insignificant in isolation, yet together they formed an unbreakable chain of evidence leading directly to her door. The fire crackled between us as Holmes continued his analysis. But perhaps her greatest miscalculation lay in the very audacity of her scheme. The locked garden, the pristine snow, the apparent impossibility of the crime, all designed to suggest supernatural agency and thus deflect suspicion from any human perpetrator. Yet it was precisely this theatrical flourish that demanded the most elaborate apparatus, leaving the greatest number of traces for the trained observer to discover. Over the following days, the loose threads of our investigation were methodically gathered and secured. Black Jack, faced with the inexorable weight of evidence, elected to turn Queen's evidence in exchange for transportation rather than the gallows. His rough but honest testimony corroborated every detail of Holmes's reconstruction, from the private room where Mrs. Vale had hired him in masculine disguise to the pulley system that had transported Thornton's unconscious form across the garden railings. The stolen naval documents were returned to the Admiralty with that discretion which such sensitive matters require, while the network of prominent gentlemen who had fallen victim to Mrs. Vale's blackmail schemes breathed more easily, knowing their secrets would remain buried. At the Old Bailey, Mrs. Vale maintained her composure with a dignity that earned misplaced sympathy from some quarters, yet the mesh of evidence proved inexorable. She received her sentence without display, walking from the dock with an erect carriage that suggested she regarded her conviction as merely another performance concluded. "There is a curious irony in it all, Watson," Holmes observed one evening, as we reviewed the case's final disposition. Mrs. Vale possessed talents that might have graced the legitimate stage, intelligence that could have achieved distinction in any number of respectable endeavours, yet she chose to employ these gifts in service of greed and murder. It serves as a sobering reminder that genius without moral foundation becomes merely a more dangerous form of criminality. Holmes took up his violin, drawing from its strings those melancholy airs that seemed to capture the complex emotions stirred by our recent adventure. The music filled our sitting room with haunting beauty, a fitting epilogue to a case that had revealed both the depths of human deception and the ultimate triumph of methodical investigation. As the final notes faded into silence, Holmes set aside his instrument and reached for the morning papers that Mrs. Hudson had left upon the side table, his restless intellect, never content with past achievements, was already turning toward whatever fresh mysteries the new day might bring. "The snow covers many sins, Watson," he said, with that enigmatic smile which indicated his mind was already engaged with future problems, "but it also preserves the evidence of human folly with crystalline clarity. In the end, it was not supernatural agency that placed our gentleman in that locked garden, but rather the very human combination of greed, desperation, and misguided cleverness." He glanced toward the window where dawn was beginning to paint the sky with pale light. "Come, my dear fellow, London awakens to new mysteries, and the game, as always, is afoot. Let us see what fresh puzzles await the attention of minds willing to look beyond the obvious and seek the truth that lies buried beneath appearances." And so concluded another chapter in our long association, leaving me once again filled with admiration for my friend's remarkable gifts and grateful for the privilege of witnessing genius applied in service of justice and truth.